Welcome to No Rares Required, episode 39, Gruul Power 4. I've really enjoyed drafting green in Lord of the Rings Tales of Middle-earth, mostly because everyone else avoids it, which makes it rather consistent to build, and sometimes it feels like you're the only green drafter in the pod. This is especially true outside of MTG Arena in some of the competitive tournaments that I like to play. Gruul's archetype is all about creatures with 4 power. Enraged Hjorn, Baggin Porter, Mirror Guardian, and Relentless Rohirrim all have 4 power, and cards like In's Fury and Warbeast of Golgoroth synergize or have extra boons centered around having a creature with power 4 or more. Many of these red cards also are great performers in Rakdos, so it's a pretty decent place to pivot if black feels too contested. And to be clear, I'm not here to claim that this is the best deck in the format, or that you should set out to draft it from the start, but I've enjoyed having it in my arsenal, especially in more competitive settings when you have to fight harder over the good cards. My overall approach has been to use cards like Woe's Pathfinder to ramp to a 4-cost, 4-power creature on turn 3, so I recommend going for a U-shaped curve, as long as you can snag 2 or more Woe's Pathfinders. Then just clear the way with In's Fury or red removal, and start hitting for 4 or 5 damage a turn. Kind of a classic mid-range strategy, which is nice for beginners, since the decks like Izzet Spellslinger or Dimir Control that I covered in previous weeks can be a bit more complicated to play and rely on you anticipating your opponent's plays. So with that said, let's dive into the cards individually, discuss some alternatives that I've found successful, and hopefully get you those trophies even when you have to draft green. Smite the Deathless is excellent red removal, and after coming up against Witch King of Angmar, the 5/3 mythic flyer that you can discard a card to tap it and make it indestructible, I've really enjoyed the flavor of exiling it with Smite the Deathless. The ideal situation is to clear the path for whatever you were able to ramp to on turn 3, but removing top quality cards like Nazgul can also come in handy, and the fact that it exiles means that you don't have to worry about them bringing it back with cards like Sam's Desperate Rescue. Warbeast of Golgoroth is a common I've had my eye on since before I got to play the set. Even just as a 5/4 that spawns a 2/2 army when it dies, it's at least good filler. But when the majority of your deck is designed to have power 4 or more, then it goes way up. Gruul is the card's best archetype, and usually it isn't hard to find at least 2 for the top end of your deck. I've talked a fair amount about Rally at the Hornburg in my guides to Boros, Rakdos, and Izzet. I think they all do a better job of taking advantage of what Rally at the Hornburg has to offer, but the card offers so much I'd still recommend grabbing them for Gruul. Gruul doesn't have many 2-drops, and even though you aren't looking to trigger humans entering the battlefield or lining them up to be level 4 ring bearers, they do a great job of gumming up the early game while you build to your mid-range threats. Relentless Rohirrim is the best 4-powered creature at common. Ramping to this on turn 3 off of Woe's Pathfinder allows you to make your Pathfinder into a ring bearer, and although this archetype doesn't have a lot of ring temptation triggers, it does have some, and getting to level 2 is very handy for looting into your mid-range threats. In's Fury is the reason to end up in Gruul. Being able to hit one of your 4-power creatures and get a permanent +1/+1 counter is amazing pressure. Just hope that they don't have removal up, or better yet, play around your opponent's removal so you don't get 2 for 1. I often decide to head into green when I see In's Fury still available around pick 7 or 8, and is my preferred green signal card at common. As I mentioned at the beginning, part of my strategy is getting to my 4 and 5-cost 4-powered creatures as soon as possible, and the ramp off Woe's Pathfinder helps me do just that. Being able to tap for mana of any color is also helpful when you find yourself in the green Legendaries deck, which I alluded to in my guide to Selesnya, but I will probably save the in-depth guide for when I cover Simic, just because Simic needs some help. I haven't been a big fan of splashing off-color cards in this archetype, but the ramp has been very helpful. And I've heard people claim that this is green's best common, And of all of the archetypes I can think of, or I think Gruul has the weakest 3 cost slot. So ramping to 4 on turn 3 works quite well for Gruul. And then later in the game, the 7 cost mana sink ability has been quite relevant, especially since it gives the target creature trample. Improvised Club is worth a mention, but you need to think about how well it fits into your deck. Sacrificing a big 4-powered creature is not a good plan unless it wins you the game. But I will be covering some cards at Uncommon that create 1/1 tokens or food tokens that make this a more playable option. Just something to keep in mind. Enraged Hjorn is in the category of unwanted green cards that I want to take advantage of during the draft. Enraged Hjorn wheels when green is open. It has Trample, which is great at pushing damage through, and if they do have removal, you at least get a Ring Temptation when this enters the battlefield. You only get so many cards at the 5 cost slot, but I usually want 1 or 2. Bag and Porter is another 4-powered creature in green that is underrated, also available on the wheel. You don't even need legendary synergies to make this playable, and it's more just extra icing if you happen to have some legendary uncommons on the battlefield. And my last underrated 4-power creature is Mirror Guardian. Also available on the wheel. I've had some really fun turns of playing this on turn 3, then playing 2 Ints Furies to clear 2 creatures and hit my opponent for 8 on turn 4. It's a very aggressive line, but you're left with a 6/4 on turn 4 that if they kill, you at least get a Ring Temptation. And now for the uncommons. Eomer of the Rittermark is busted. It's even a top-performing uncommon in decks that aren't red, since at 5 cost and a single pip of red, it's an excellent splash. In Gruul, it synergizes with Warbeast of Golgoroth, where if they trade into Eomer, which they are incentivized to do so they don't end up drowning in 1/1s, you also get a 2/2 army. So a 5/4 haste for 5 that leaves behind a 1/1 and maybe even a 2/2? Yes, please. It's great on the race, since the 1/1 can chump block their biggest attacker, basically Chimney Rabble 2.0, and it also is a legendary, so it makes Bag and Porter attack as a 5/5 if you happen to play it on turn 4. Another busted uncommon is Fearfire Foes. The one thing that I would like to advise you about is not holding on to this card for too long. Sometimes you're tempted to wait for a huge board, but keep in mind that they can fizzle this with cards like Improvised Club or Nasty End, so be a little wary if you're up against black or red and 2 open mana. As soon as this can snag 2 creatures, or sometimes even just clear a Protector of Gondor with the associated 1/1 so that you can push damage, I think it's worth playing. Book of Mazarbul I've mentioned in my previous guides as well, especially with the turn 2 rally at the Hornburg. You've set yourself up to attack with a massive amount of damage. I've really liked it in Gruul as well, since it gets better if you plan on playing an aggressive creature on turn 4, which this archetype aims to do. Gift of Strands is an uncommon that can wheel that I think is undervalued, at least in Gruul. It doesn't fit well into the other green archetypes, but there isn't very much instant speed removal that results in this getting 2-for-1, as long as you are playing it on something with 4 toughness or more to avoid getting hit by Smite the Deathless. The Scry 2 is almost equivalent to a card draw. It has Flash, so you can use it as a combat trick that sticks around for several rounds, and you're looking to push damage before your opponent finds cards like Horses of the Brunnen, which can be very difficult for this archetype. It isn't great if they remove your creature the following turn, so I like it after I've drawn some removal from my opponent, but the Scry 2 makes it not the end of the world if they do end up having removal. Foray of Orcs is an uncommon that I love in every red archetype except for Boros. I really like it to clear away a 2/2 army from cards like Dunlin Crebain on 3, so that you can attack with Mirror Guardian that you played on your turn 3, for example. It can be a bit lackluster later in the game, but you also have Warbeast of Golgoroth, and sometimes that can line up quite nicely to remove even a big creature. Ranger's Firebrand is worth a mention, but I do think its worst red archetype is Gruul. You have some Ring Temptations, not as much as Rakdos or Izzet, but You also aren't aiming to play creatures that make good ring bearers, like Bill the Pony, or Bilbo, or even a Dunlin Crebain. And since it's good red removal, you usually have to pass on a pick 2 or 3 for this card. But just like Foray of Orcs, 2 damage can clear the path for your mid-range threats. Grishnak, Brash Instigator, is also better in Rakdos, where you can maximize the amass synergies in your deck. It's still a 3/3 over 2 bodies that helps clear the way for a turn for your Mirror Guardian early on, and it's worth including. Meriadoc Brandybuck is a card that synergizes quite nicely with Improvised Club. And food in general is nice to have as if it comes down to a race. For example, the rare land, the green, the Shire, performs above average in this archetype, so don't discount Meriadoc. You won't have the synergies of attacking with a ring-bearing Frodo like you would in Celestia, nor Shelob's Ambush to help ensure that it doesn't just die on its first attack like you might in Golgari, but it's still a decent inclusion in Gruul. And speaking of food, Stew the Conies is also a good inclusion. Most of your creatures are great at fighting and biting, and you can plan on either sacrificing the food token to Improvised Club or popping it for 3 health, depending on your circumstances. And the last uncommon worth the spotlight is Strider, Ranger of the North. Another 4 power, 4 cost creature, but it has landfall that gives a creature +1/+1 until end of turn, and first strike if the creature has power 4 or greater. The first strike can come in handy if all you have is Int's Fury for removal, and you're staring across at a Death Touch creature. And now for the rares. Fall of Gil-galad works quite well in your deck with full of beefy creatures, but you don't usually want to play it on turn 2, so keep that in mind when placing it in your curve. The 2 +1/+1 counters come on the upkeep the turn after you play it, so you want to make sure that you have at least 1 creature when you play it. Ideally 2. The Scry 2 is close to a card draw, and then the 3rd chapter does what your deck does quite well, which is fight your opponent's creatures. An interesting line that has happened a handful of times is if you choose a legendary creature to fight that you also have a copy stuck in your hand, after you attack, you can play the second legendary, causing the previous one to leave the battlefield and trigger the draw 2. Not usually how it will play out, but I thought it was worth a mention. The other standout rare is Doors of Durin. Since the majority of your deck is made up of 4 power creatures, they enter the battlefield tapped and attacking quite well. Mirror Guardian, the 4/2 3-drop, is also a green dwarf, so it can even enter the battlefield with trample if the stars align. And the only standout mythic for basically every green deck is Radagast the Brown. Most of the creatures have different creature types from one another, and it helps dig to your War Beasts of Golgoroth or Enraged Horns quite well. That's it for my thoughts on Gruul. If you found this guide to be helpful, be sure to check out the other episodes of No Rares Required. I aim to publish at least 1 archetype each week. Remember to hit like and subscribe for more No Rares Required content. We have 5 weeks left until the next set, Wilds of Eldraine, comes to Arena September 5th, and 4 more archetypes to cover. If there is a specific archetype that you'd like me to cover next, let me know in the comments below. Happy trophy hunting, and I'll see you all next week.